Okay, we're going to get started. I think there's still going to be people joining us, but just in the interest of preserving everybody's time, we're going to get going, and the beginning is less important than the middle and the end. So, hello and welcome to tonight's panel discussion, Pride Month and Mental Health, Supporting LGBTQIA plus Children and Youth. My name is Kristen Pierce-Freaky. I'm the Executive Director of Austin Child Guidance Center, and I'm going to be moderating tonight's panel discussion about mental health challenges LGBTQIA plus children and youth may face, why, and ways that we can support them. This conversation is part of a panel discussion series for those who are interested in learning more about sometimes uncomfortable and sensitive topics and how to address them with children. A little bit about us. Austin Child Guidance Center has a 70-year history of providing accessible, high-quality, trauma-informed mental health services to children and their families. Our three main focus areas, care and treatment, which includes individual, family, and group therapy, psychological assessments and consultation, and psychiatric care and medication management. We also offer the only walk-in children's mental health clinic in Central Texas. Our second area is training and professional development programs, an opportunity for staff, the community, and various community groups. And finally, community education awareness, events and programs such as this, and other panel discussions. We have a podcast and other presentations. ACGC employs a team of highly trained and experienced social workers, therapists, psychologists, psychiatric nurse practitioner, and case managers who provide a range of services. We are currently offering services via teletherapy as well as in person. And with the addition of teletherapy, we are able to provide care for any child or teen up to the age of 17 years of age living in the state of Texas. Our goal, again, is to provide access to high-quality mental health care in a safe, equitable, and healing space for children and families. As part of that work, we work to confront systemic barriers to mental health, discrimination, and economic injustice in our community. End of my commercial for ACGC. I want to take a moment to cover some housekeeping items. Please keep your microphones and video off during the presentation. This presentation will be recorded and posted on our website early next week. The chat box is open for you to ask questions and engage with the panelists and participants. Please feel free to post resources or relevant information in the chat box, and we will send those resources to everybody out next week. And we'd ask that you just keep the questions related to the topic at hand. We acknowledge that each of us may come to this discussion with different perspectives, experiences, political views, and comfort levels. We ask that you be respectful of others who may not be in the same place as you. We acknowledge that this can be sometimes a difficult subject for some and may make people uncomfortable, but we ask that you make room for those conversations to happen anyway. And we understand that sometimes in order to move forward and kind of gain better understanding, that sometimes we have to experience a little bit of discomfort. Certainly, we ask that you refrain from using any abusive language towards others participating in this discussion. We do remove people, and we haven't had to, but we can and we will if it's necessary. So with all of that out of the way, I want to introduce you to our panelists. Each comes with a deep knowledge, commitment, and passion for children, families, and advocating for ways our society can better address issues facing children and teens. So I'm going to start with Mariah. Mariah Luton is a licensed clinical social worker who has worked with ACGC for over 2.5 years. She's worked with children and families providing individual and family therapy, as well as parent coaching for over 9 years. She specializes in working with children with anxiety and depression and children who have experienced trauma. And she continues to build her knowledge and expertise in working with these children and teens who identify as LGBTQIA+. As an ally, it is of great importance that youth who identify as LGBTQIA+ have access to the mental health support they need to thrive. Thanks for joining us, Mariah. Elena Welsh, they, them, is a third-year student at Southwestern University, where they are pursuing degrees in English and feminist studies. They are also an intern at Bloomsday Literary, a Houston-based nonprofit publishing house that centers diverse voices in its publications. As a white, queer, and disabled citizen of the United States, Elena is constantly consuming academic literary, and other mediums of information about systems of power and resistant care ethics to situate themselves and their work within dialogues of equity and representation. Currently, they are working on an honors thesis about subversive worldviews in fantasy novels by marginalized authors and a capstone project about expressions of gender and sexuality in non-binary people. Thank you, Elena. Finally, Virginia Williamson is a licensed marriage and family therapist and founder of the Collaborative Counseling Group with over 15 years of experience in her field. She began her career in early childhood education working with children who had been identified as struggling behaviorally. Quickly realizing that she wanted to have a deeper understanding of the family, she was led to systems theory and the pursuit of a degree in marriage and family therapy at Fairfield University. Virginia's current focus, beyond continuing her passion for being an active part of the mental health professional community and providing therapy to therapists and self-starters, is offering clinically sound supervision to fellow psychotherapists. Virginia is also mom to a cisgender son entering his junior year of college and a transgender daughter entering high school. Their experiences as a family and her own experience as a mother and a helping professional in the LGBTQIA+ community allows her to have a unique perspective on the physical and emotional challenges that arise and the joyful celebrations of their success over those challenges. Thank you to all of our panelists. We really appreciate your time tonight. So I want to just start by introducing the topic. Obviously, June is Pride Month, a time for the community to honor the 1969 Stonewall riots and works to achieve equal justice and equal opportunity for LGBTQIA+ Americans. It is also a time for us to reflect on the struggles and experiences of this community today that may impact their mental well-being. In 2020, the Trevor Project's national survey found that 42% of LGBTQIA+ youth seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year, including more than half of transgender and non-binary youth. Additionally, 72% of this population, this youth population, reported symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder in the past 2 weeks, including more than 3 in 4 transgender and non-binary youth, and 62% of LGBTQ+ youth reported symptoms of major depressive disorder in the past 2 weeks, including transgender and non-binary youth. So tonight we're going to discuss the experiences and challenges of this youth population and their mental health impacts and the ways that we as a community can support these children at school or at home. It should be noted today that this panel discussion also addresses the mental health concerns of gender nonconforming youth. Some of these individuals may not identify as part of the LGBTQ+ community, but they also face stressors related to gender. So I just want to remind everybody that this is not a debate tonight. We're just having a conversation. And so I'm going to jump right in. And I wanted to just ask, I'm going to start with you, Elena. In terms of the importance of language and identity in the LGBTQ+ community, what does it stand for? What does LGBTQIA+, what does it stand for? What does it represent?
So the acronym LGBTQIA+ is a kind of umbrella term to refer to the queer community. As a disclaimer, I use the word queer for ease of speech. Not everyone who's a part of the community is comfortable with that word. So it very much depends on the person that you're talking to. But in the acronym that is more commonly used, it's a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and then the A is asexual, aromantic, or agender. And then the plus is meant to incorporate other identities that might be a part of this community or might identify with this community. And at least in my experience, it's just kind of an umbrella term. And it's meant to be flexible enough to change with the terminology that is constantly changing and language that is constantly changing with people's evolving identities and understandings of what those mean. So, yes.
Sorry about that, got stuck in mute. You mentioned questioning, I think, in your response. Can you talk more about what that means for those that don't understand what that means?
So questioning is kind of the process of learning to understand your own identity. So that can be with regards to your sexuality or your gender. And those can be interrelated or different things. And yeah, I don't know. I think of it as a process of understanding. Yeah.
Does anybody, and I guess I'm going to also just offer this to any panelists who also kind of want to jump in as I'm asking some of these other questions. But so for many people are confused by the difference between gender and sexual orientation. And I wonder if someone could clarify that for those on the call.
I can if we would like. I don't want to like take
that would be great.
Else's. Okay.
No, go ahead.
So gender identity is kind of related to the cultural construct of gender, which has traditionally been understood, at least in Western society, as like men and women. But it just has to do with the way that you perform yourself and the way that you perceive yourself and present that to other people. And that is becoming more complicated as more queer people are coming out and talking about their perceptions of their own gender. Whereas sexuality is who you're attracted to or who you are not attracted to, and whether or not you do or don't feel sexual attraction to other people. So in my instance, I came out as bisexual years before I realized that I was non-binary. And that was just my journey, and it's different for everybody. And those kind of relate to each other, but they also don't. So yeah.
Just to follow up to that, I mean, so understanding that everybody's journey is different. Is there any age limit in your opinion or in your experience on how early someone can realize their identity?
I'm not a therapist. I'm not trained in therapy, but I do believe that as soon as you become aware of your relationality to other people and the way that you behave in response to other people and the way that you dress and stuff, I think that you can have an idea of your own identity. And the great thing about identity is that it can change throughout your life. And there are all of these different ways of understanding that and these terms that are changing with that as well. So it's just because you say that you identify one way when you're younger doesn't necessarily mean you're wrong when you change that when you're older or whatever. So I don't think issues of age necessarily have a lot to do with it. It's just how you understand yourself in relation to other people.
Okay, so you did mention you're not a therapist, so I'm going to ask the same question to the therapists on the panel. So Mariah or Virginia, please jump in with that response if you would.
I've read some research where children can, as early as 4 years of age, start to know a little bit more about their gender identity, right? And they can express it in different ways. So that's kind of how early I've heard and read about. Like I think Alina mentioned, I think children can begin to explore things at an early age and make changes along the way as they grow and learn about themselves. Yeah, that's a little bit about what I know.
Virginia?
I'm still learning.
As we all are.
Mm-hmm.
Were you asking me to respond?
Yes, if you would. Yes, please.
Sure. I know we have limited time. I mean, as a parent, I can say for my daughter, and in our community where we live, everything was fairly gender stereotyped, boys' toys, girls' toys. It's changed a bit since then, but at that time, but for as long as she could express herself, she would gravitate toward things that would be in the past categorized as female toys, and she always gravitated toward female even before she was verbal. So I really believe strongly that who you are at your core is stable from the time that you're born, and yes, that can change and evolve, and we support that, but I think we have to believe our kids if they say this is how I'm feeling, or we have to support our children if they gravitate towards something that feels unusual to us, or well, I guess that's it.
So the follow-up that I would have is, it's interesting because there's consensus that identity can change over time, but I feel like even that concept is relatively new, right? Because kind of growing up as a kid, or many people in society don't have that perspective, right? Because you're something, right? Your gender and your identity, you're born with it or whatever, and there's a perception for many people that that is not something that is fluid. And so I wondered if, someone could speak to that issue of, speaking more about the concept that identities are fluid and kind of like where that idea, how that idea has shifted over time, because that's definitely a shift from, many of us who are of a certain age that was not communicated, or that certainly was not the way that many were raised to understand identity.
I can talk on it a bit and then pass along. I know for myself with my daughter and also with clients, some of it is about permission, so I've seen some of my clients that now identify as transgender or non-binary started, especially if they're more in my age group, they kind of started with, I think I'm gay, and as a way to sort of see how people would respond. And then as they received support and appropriate care, were able to explore further if that was where they identified or if there was another place that felt more correct to them. So I think some of it is about permission, which I feel like we're getting there, but it's still limited. And some of it is just, I think we all experience this need to grow and change, and there's more and more room for people to grow and change in ways that, why should it matter to you how I identify? Why should it matter to you who I am in love with? So I think we're coming along, but.
Anybody else want to add anything to that? Okay. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I have a bit, like, I'm 20, so I've grown up with a lot of discourse on LGBTQ issues and joys and all of that. Although I do remember that when I was in like elementary and middle school, it wasn't talked about as much. And I think, and with the people around me, a lot of us were not talking about queer issues until I came out. And in my own experience, I had this idea that I was a trans man before I realized that I was somewhere in the middle of woman and man. And there was this progression of my own identity and not necessarily communicating that with other people because it wasn't talked about very much. And then learning, I guess, through myself, and then eventually through the queer theory that I've read extensively in my college career, that there's a lot of people who experience that sort of fluidity and that change over time. And that's okay. And it's really cool to talk about and to explore that with people. So I agree that it's a matter of permission and having discussion with other people. And I'm glad that we're kind of opening up to that a bit more now.
Thank you for that. I kind of want to just speak about pronouns for a minute. There's a lot of, again, in the last 15, 20 years, the sort of onset of kind of prefacing communication with pronouns or identifying your pronouns. Even in the last year or two, I've had people who've received an email from me ask me, why do you have she, her, hers under your name? Like, what is that? And so I wanted to just talk about how to navigate conversations with people about their pronouns. Why are they important? What do they, some people don't care what pronoun you use. Some people are very specific about the pronouns you use, and sort of just talking about, I know that a lot of, I've had feedback from parents and people who are concerned because it's like, well, I referred to someone by the wrong pronoun by mistake and they kind of got mad at me, but how was I supposed to know? Right. And, is it not okay for me to get it wrong if they don't tell me what it is. How will, I'm communicating based on what I see, right? If I don't know what the right answer is, like, why should I be made to feel bad? So I want to kind of just address that in terms of why are they important, and how to have conversations with people about how they should appropriately address you or people as part of this community.
I could share with you a little bit about some of the children that I've worked with on youth. And I have to say, I want to be transparent, say I make mistakes all the time with pronouns, and I do my best to practice it. And I think that's something that I definitely encourage parents to do and other people to do, is like practice the pronoun when you're not with the person. But I do make mistakes sometimes. But I find that it is so important with the kiddos that I'm working with, them being able to say, this is the pronoun that I choose, and this is how I would like you to address me. It can be so empowering as they're coming out to me and maybe their family members. And it can be so disempowering, I think, when maybe parents or people around them choose not to use that pronoun or the given name that they've chosen, from my experience.
Virginia?
And my experience is that typically if you ask, if the person understands that you are unclear and you're respecting them enough to ask, that's really what it's not, in my experience, which I know is a slice, of this, but if you're caring enough and respecting them enough to ask, then it means that you're not intending to be offensive and you may just be confused. So and I know it can also feel awkward to ask if you're unsure, but in my experience, that's the best thing to do. And also, most people, like any of us with things that we have to encounter, are understanding if you've just made a mistake. I think it's usually clear if you're intending to be offensive or you're intending to be discounting of the person. But if it comes across clearly that it's just an error or a family member that's adjusting, usually everybody's patient, with that process.
Elena, do you have something you want to add? Or
No, I agree with what both of them have said. I think asking is one of the most important things you can do. And honestly, I've challenged myself to just start off neutral with everybody. So I have been practicing in my head, just calling everyone they, no matter how I see them, until I know what pronouns they use. And I've made plenty of mistakes as well. One of my ex-partners came out as trans, like in the middle of our relationship, and that was a huge adjustment for me. And I had to practice using the proper pronouns in my head. It's a matter of ingraining it in your thoughts and then starting to use that in your speech, and really just practicing using people's proper pronouns and asking those questions.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's really a matter of respect, and certainly as it relates to children, it's a way to empower them and empower, our peers and adults as well. And so I think regardless of regardless of the pronouns or why, it doesn't really matter why. It's sort of how people need and want to be addressed. And so we're respecting that, right? Virginia, I'm going to direct this next question to you first. Historically, identifying as transgender or homosexual was considered a mental health issue. I mean, there were diagnoses in the DSM. While that's no longer the case, in your opinion, how has that impacted the LGBTQ plus community and their experiences today? What are some of the social systems and norms that impact that community? Bathroom bills, security concerns. There's all kinds of I'm trying to use like
Gotcha. And
Yeah,
I'm going to try not to use my hands. I keep raising my hands, which
Yeah, no, I'm trying to use non-political terms. There's a lot of really unfortunate laws and bills that have been passed in the state of Texas. So, like, I'm just curious, like, how has the history of some of these identities and the fact that they were pathologized for many, many years, in your opinion, how has that impacted this population today?
I think like anything else, because at one time, both being homosexual and having any sort of gender dysphoria, being transgender, that those were categorized as being ill. It takes a long time to come back from something like that. Again, I'll say it enough times that you want to push me off my virtual chair. We've come a long way, but it takes, in my experience, quite a while to come back from something being categorized as an illness. And I'm sure we can't go into any sort of religious realm, but we have to understand how some of these categories were created and the time frame in which they were created. But there are plenty of folks that have difficulty understanding that these are no longer categorized as illnesses, and in my opinion, creating laws based upon that it's no longer warranted, and we have to be just protective of all of our kiddos regardless, and everybody's rights regardless. And certain conversations are best left in different arenas, and what we know to be true, the DSM is a evolving body of knowledge, based on how mental health professionals see and treat the people that they're trying to help. But these are no longer categorized as illnesses. So to continue to treat them as if they are, in my opinion, it creates an environment where people just don't get the correct care. And when people aren't getting appropriate care, it affects everybody around them.
Sorry, can you just, and I did this first, but can you explain to the group what the DSM is? I shouldn't have used the acronym.
Oh, no, that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. So at one point in time, your sexuality and your gender identity was considered to be a mental health disorder that could essentially be cured, which is no longer the belief. It's not something that's meant to be cured because it's not an illness. You may develop symptoms of depression or anxiety as a result of not being accepted in your family and in your community, but in and of itself, your sexuality and your gender identity, neither of those two things make you ill.
Thank you. Mariah, did you want to add anything from the mental health perspective in terms of, what are some of the social systems and norms that impact the LGBTQ community, especially the kiddos?
Well, I think one of the thoughts that came up when you were mentioning the bathroom bill, and maybe even Greg Abbott's directive in February, is like these things, I feel like, and I don't know the research behind it, honestly, but I feel like when I'm working with kiddos, these messages that they're getting from the media, getting from our governor, getting from our representatives, often I think, whether they're aware of it completely or not, are impacting them, and their mental health and their well-being and how they see themselves, and whether they feel like they belong, and whether they feel like they're supportive or supported, right? Those are some thoughts that I have around that.
I think with that, a lot of times with some of the, I'm going to call it information, and I think largely erroneous information that is communicated, or stereotypes, people are being stereotyped. So often the LGBTQ community, there's, I think, certain people in our society are stoking fears about this community by using stereotypes and stereotyping them in certain ways. And I guess, one of the things that come to mind I saw on social media somewhere is that, something about drag shows, don't go to drag shows, these people are harmful and whatever, kind of doling out all of these stereotypes. And someone posted, sure, don't do this, but this person is harmful, but they had a picture of I think it was like somebody from the Duger family or somebody who had just recently been found guilty of child pornography, but this person who was sort of is okay. And I think that I feel like any stereotyping of any population or any community is harmful in my estimation. But I'm curious about, in your opinion, are there specific stereotypes, or in what ways are the stereotypes about the LGBTQ plus community and gender policing and all of these things, what can we do to help to counter some of these stereotypes? How can we communicate with some of these kiddos to help them advocate for themselves, I guess, when they feel like they're being stereotyped or people are interacting with them or communicating with them with stereotypical ideas, perspectives, and statements. Elena, start with you.
I think that a lot of the stereotyping of the queer community is what kept me from coming out sooner in my life. And the ways that the people around me have been most supportive to me is just asking questions and consuming media by queer people for queer people, and then interrogating their own perspectives on how we present ourselves and how different identity categories present themselves. And I do think a lot of the push for all these different labels within the community is, on one hand, to be very inclusive, but on another hand, to be able to just define yourself against this really oppressive gaze of heteronormativity. And I don't know, I feel like there's this often like self-policing within the queer community as well because of stereotyping. I know I found in myself, I tend to like dress masc or I dress femme, and that has a lot to do with how I perceive masculine and feminine gender roles and however I'm feeling on a particular day. So just asking questions, consuming media, and then being very mindful of your own stereotyping of other people. And when being encountered, or when encountering someone else's stereotyping, like questioning that and being like, hey, why do you think that way? Why is this something that you have perceived, not in an aggressive way, but in a curious way? Yeah.
Mariah, did you want to add anything?
I think I just say I love what Elena said about just like asking questions, and I think that's a big part of it, and helping us understand where kiddos are coming from and how we can be supportive. Yeah.
Do you feel like, I mean, if you're a child and you're kind of facing some of these things, are there things that we could do or ways that we could help prepare younger kids who are in this community to face certain things like that? Because again, depending on the age, they're not necessarily going to be able to absorb what's being said to them, or absorb some kind of stereotyping and come and respond with a curiosity. I mean, for many kids, and this is one of the things that we see all the time, it's like, it's debilitating. It's traumatic for them. Virginia, can you kind of, do you have any thoughts on that?
When you say we, do you mean we?
I'm sorry.
Mental health community.
Yes, I do. That is what I meant. We as the mental health professionals in the community, or we as adults, and allies and people who are wanting to support these kids.
I mean, I immediately wanted to go to, we could begin a whole different way of approaching kids from the time that they enter into that environment when they start to gender identify or feel like they have to. But that's not what we're talking about at this moment. As mental health professionals, it's listening, it's being open. I know for myself, I had clients who prior to my experience with my daughter, I had clients that came to me as kids with their families that have now come out in their teenage years or young adulthood, and nothing about gender identity or sexuality. Well, at that point, for most of them, sexuality wasn't even a consideration, I don't think. That didn't come up. And families weren't bringing it up, and it was just a family bringing their child to me that was in distress. And so this is maybe pushing the envelope, but from my perspective, if we could somehow normalize the conversation from a younger age about how, if we could somehow say to kids at a younger age, ask them questions about their gender identity in an age appropriate way so that it doesn't feel like something that they have to tell us, meaning we're asking them to be braver than we are as adults, right? Like, come out and tell us that you feel so different from your peers. Are there ways that we can incorporate questions into how we work with kids that just normalize this and allow them an opportunity to say how they feel? And if they don't feel that way, I imagine parents might fear, well, if we introduce that topic in any way, it's going to influence my child. I know that there are parents that may feel that way, but those kids that don't feel that way, they're not, it's gonna, in my view, be like you ask them about an alien and then they moved on to another topic. So I do feel like as mental health professionals, we could incorporate more into our sort of assessment phase that normalizes questions about how they feel about their bodies, how they feel about, their peers, how they, what they like to play with, who they enjoy engaging with in ways that would give us an idea sooner, so that we're not relying on them to sort of come out, with this sort of big declaration. But that's me talking as a parent and a mental health professional. So take that with a grain of salt.
Well, now you've got me curious, because I'm sitting here trying to think about kind of like, what are some ways that I could approach a child or ask them these types of questions when they're, so that they don't, to your point, need to sort of psych themselves up and spend all this time kind of agonizing over how they're going to communicate and make this big declaration, as kids, when, to your point, a lot of adults aren't that brave, or it takes a lot of adults a long time to do that same thing. In your either professional or personal experience, have there been certain questions, or have there been certain things that you've come up with, or that you have used along the way that have that kind of fall into the kind of category of some of the things that you're talking about?
I don't really work with young ones at the moment. So by the time they're coming to me at this moment, they're usually teenagers, young adults. But even with young ones, I certainly feel now that I would focus more on their general experience in the world and ask questions that might help me to better understand the context, versus I focused a lot on the family, who's supporting you, what's going on in the household, those types of things. And of course, school and any issues there and all of those kinds of things. But I wouldn't have ventured into, how do you feel with your peers? What types of things do you like to do? Are those types of things accepted by your, I wouldn't barrage them with questions, but if a child were to say to me now that they felt like they were excluded, or that they were trying to engage with peers in ways that didn't seem acceptable, I would ask more follow-up questions now, better understanding than I would have at the start of my career. Because I hope that we can get to a place, which is probably idealistic, where, because kids know so much more than we do anyway, like I feel like I'm holding back because I'm gonna use a word or a concept that they don't know, and they're like light years past me. So I'm hopeful that we can get to a place where we can just ask these questions about how you identify at an earlier age, and it's just understood. And it doesn't have to be as loaded or as uncomfortable.
That's really helpful. And I guess I just want to sort of make a general statement to the panelists, please feel free to ask questions or put feedback or comments in the chat. We really want to respond and give feedback. But Mariah, what are some ways that you think that would help to support and foster more belonging for LGBTQ kids at home or at school? What are some things that you think would be helpful there?
Well, I think it often starts at home for parents and caregivers, saying things like just making for sure that they know that they're loved and that you're there for them. Like if they're coming out to you or they're bringing up challenges that they're experiencing at school, definitely letting them know that you love and that you're there for them. I think with school representatives, they can do something similar, but using more symbols to let other kids or LGBTQ kiddos know that they're advocates and allies. And that might be simply putting a flag on their door that lets kiddos know that they're an ally. That's something that teachers can do, or school representatives. I definitely want to encourage open dialogue and being curious about their life. And then maybe what they're excited about. They're coming to you, maybe sharing with you this identity that they haven't shared with you before. And there's maybe things that they're excited about and maybe some challenges that are part of that identity. And so being open to talking about those and listening to their experience. I think also one thing we've already talked about is definitely using the pronouns and the name that they've chosen. And then also encouraging or kiddos to be able to express themselves in the ways that they feel like they need to, that are attached to their identities. Like if they're wanting to cut their hair, right? Or if they're wanting to grow it long, if they're wanting to wear makeup. These are some simple things that I think can be be challenging for parents, but are so important for kiddos as they're exploring and maybe becoming more aware of their gender identity.
So I'm going to throw this out there because while I think that's great feedback, I want to make sure that we're kind of addressing kind of all of the barriers to kind of what you're describing, because I think what you're describing, Mariah, is phenomenal. And I think that that's the ideal. I think though, certainly in Texas and plenty of other places, there's a lot of conservative viewpoints. There's a lot of conservative people. There are a lot of folks that really, parents and family members for whom, or grandparents for whom it takes a long time for them to wrap their brain around this, especially as parents and family members, we have hopes and dreams for our kids that don't necessarily match with the hopes and dreams that our kids have for themselves. And so, what are some ways that we can speak to, parents who are really struggling with this? They're struggling with it ideologically, they're potentially struggling with it, like whatever their faith tradition, what have you. But they love their children and they want to still support their kids. How can we help parents who are not the sort of, folks that are just ready to open their arms to their children, no matter, they could be purple and have, 5 legs and it wouldn't matter. But like, not every parent kind of can accept certain things very easily. So like, what are some things that you would recommend, you collectively, the panel, on ways to, and tools that we could give, or strategies that we could offer parents who struggle but they want to love their kids and they want to support their children at the same time?
I think you hit something really important. That's bringing it back to the parent and reminding them or helping them remember that they have the best interests of their child, right? They want their child to have healthy mental health, right? And well-being. And so kind of helping them rekindle or reconnect to that. And then also, I think a big part of it is giving them space to kind of talk about those concerns. And that I would do that as a mental health professional, give them space to talk about those concerns, but also redirect them to maybe some other areas of support that they can get. Maybe it's with PFLAG, right? Where they can participate in a support group for parents that also might be experiencing these conflicting emotions about their child coming out or identifying as LGBTQ, right? I think also if it's more related to their religious identity, it might be redirecting them back to their congregation and encouraging them to speak to somebody there. But definitely encouraging parents to process some of their own feelings as much as possible and avoid bringing that into their relationship with their child, even though I know that's a struggle, but avoiding that because I think it does impact their relationship with the child and also their well-being.
Elena, did you want to add something?
I think once again, I can only speak from my experience in growing up with my parents. I do know that having conversations with both my parents while I was in a session with my therapist was incredibly helpful. My therapist was absolutely essential in my whole coming out experience. And although I am technically not a child anymore, I'm just that I want to reiterate the asking questions thing. I think my mom has been incredibly loving. She buys me Pride merch whenever she sees it because she wants to show that she supports me. And my dad, although he doesn't necessarily understand the nuances of these different identity labels, he's a very cisgender heterosexual man. He asks me questions, and even today his company was doing this LGBTQ panel for like stuff that they're doing as a company to support their workers, and he asked me to come sit on that panel with him and just listen. So showing in maybe less intensely emotional conversational ways is just like the little things really add up for your kids, and asking those questions and just being there.
Thank you. Virginia?
I would, of course, agree with what everyone has said. Getting your own support is, in my view, crucial. I know that step is much more challenging for some parents and caregivers, and also may not be as accessible for some parents and caregivers, but getting your own help to sort through it, understanding that your grief is normal, you know, your anger perhaps, you know, at what you envisioned for your family, you know, that's normal, just working through that process in whatever way, whether it be in your faith community, whether it be with a mental health professional, whether it be within yourself, whether it be with family members. And then if you, at least for me, still at times, not really related to gender identity, but just with my kids in general, if I'm having a hard time being responsive in the ways that I'd like to be, I'm just quiet. Let me just hear what they have to say. You know, if I can't, if I'm saturated, if I'm not understanding, if I'm feeling my own stuff come up, whatever it is, can I just be quiet and take in what they have to say and take a pause, give it a minute, you know, give it an hour, give it a day, but can I just listen? And I really think that oftentimes that may be the best thing that we can do for ourselves and for them if we're not really there yet to have the right answers or to be the support that they really need us to be. Just not turning away, you know, turning toward them versus turning away from them can be really powerful, even if we have no idea what we're doing in that moment.
I appreciate everybody's feedback. You know, I'm sitting here kind of thinking about, you know, regardless of the identity of your kids, I think as parents, it's important for us to not process our own stuff separate and apart from our kids as they have developmental or milestones, or if they, whatever. I mean, I have cisgender children, and, when they do things or they make changes or they just kind of grow up and, whatever the thing is, I had certainly had feelings about it. My child just went away to college, and I definitely have feelings about that, but I'm, even as a mental health professional myself, I have to be sure to not put that on her, because, she's doing what she's supposed to be doing, which is going off to school and living, doing the things that college freshmen do. So I just feel like regardless of, the gender or sexual orientation or whatever of your child, as parents, to recognize what's our own stuff, and as separate as from, whatever our kids are bringing is important. So, some of these things we've kind of touched on a little bit, but are there, I've heard people say, I came out to my parents and they responded perfectly. And I've heard other people say, I came out to my family and it was like all the things you should never say, to someone who's coming out. My parents said it, and it was horrible. And I don't mean, obviously I imagine you have to leave might be the worst thing. I'm not necessarily referring to that, just in terms of like, what are in your experience, professional or personal, what have you, things that you definitely should say. I think, Virginia, you talked on a little bit about when your child is revealing something along these lines to them, and what are some things you should definitely avoid saying or doing when your child is communicating something that's so vulnerable and, really puts them out, when they're putting themselves out on that emotional limb. Anyone?
I think a couple of things is trying to, and I know it's easy to do, but trying to avoid kind of minimizing their coming out, right? And saying, well, this is just a phase, right? You're just going through a phase. Things are going to look different, right, down the road. And so really just avoiding minimizing. And I think the second one's not coming to mind, so I'll let the others.
If you can muster it, saying I'm glad you told me, which again, I know if you're really feeling shocked, or if your child coming out is something that is against your beliefs about the world, I imagine it would be incredibly difficult to say, I'm glad you told me. But going back to most of the parents that I've encountered, they do first and foremost love and want the best for their child, even if they're incredibly confused and hurt. And in the parent groups that I've participated in, we run the gamut in terms of our walk of life, our ages, our political beliefs, our religious views. And the commonality is we once had children that were in extreme distress, and that runs, the spectrum, some that needed to be hospitalized, and some that were, anxious and depressed, but kind of managing through. And once they came out and had support, we all collectively, regardless of our backgrounds, saw a tremendous difference and such relief in our kids. So if you can get yourself to a place to say, I'm glad you told me, and then kind of work out, all the different emotions and stages that you have to work through, from my view, that is incredibly affirming, even if you can't get into the nuts and bolts of what does this mean for you and where do we go from here and all of that, just to say, I'm glad you told me. And of course, always, I love you and those types of things. But so that's what I would say. And again, in my experience, it's universal that when you see relief in your child, even if it's something that's really difficult to understand, most people land in a place of they seem well, and before they didn't seem well.
Elena, I love the comment that you put in the chat. Did you want to add anything?
About the comment in the chat actually relates to this topic a little bit. I came out to my parents through writing. I had thought about it for weeks, and I just wrote out everything that I wanted to say, and I let them respond in their own time. I do know that when peers have come out to me, in general, like it feels like a really big deal, and it is, or it can be a really big deal for an individual when they're coming out, but I don't want to make it feel like it's a big deal from me. Like, I want to show that I'm supportive and that it's not something abnormal, and it doesn't need to be something that's like this. I don't know how, I can't think of words, but I think I'm trying to convey the emotion. And I mean, I think that when I initially came out, I didn't want to have a whole conversation about logistics. Like, what does this mean for your future? What does this mean for like how your life is going to look like? I'm not thinking about that. I'm just thinking about telling you how I feel right now. And just validating that emotion by saying, I'm glad you told me this, like Virginia said, and I love you. That's so important. I think that's a emotionally validating way of addressing that.
Thank you. I would remiss if I didn't mention sort of the statistics on attempted suicide and completed suicide, and major depression and anxiety among this population. It's off the charts compared to other youth and teens. And I think, to the point that's been made in this last question, and the point that Virginia and Elena have made, sometimes these responses can kind of be a life and death situation, meaning, the distress level of some kids, either in holding this secret or holding this information and being fearful about communicating it to the others, and will I be accepted, and will my parents still love me? Or even if they've communicated it and it didn't go well, or it seemed like it went okay at first, and then kind of, the wheels fell off somehow, creates even more vulnerability and increases sort of the likelihood of bad outcomes for these kids. And we have to remember that, again, sexual orientation and gender aside, kids by definition are more impulsive. Their brains are still developing. They're very, very pliable in some instances, and kind of susceptible to peer pressure and social media and all those other things. So on top of this issue, kids and adolescents are kind of vulnerable just by virtue of being children and adolescents. So can we speak to, I'm going to kind of focus on the mental health professional a little bit, statistics and the realities of supporting this population and ways that we can support these kids, given, the stakes in terms of keeping them alive, frankly, and keeping them well. And as parents, kind of talking about putting our own stuff aside, the recognition and the realization that if I don't support my kid, even if I have different ideology, that I might lose my child, which I would hope is unacceptable. Virginia?
I'm hesitating. I don't want to keep jumping in.
Jump in.
I feel like this is true for any issue where a child may be thinking, maybe having suicidal thoughts, right? It doesn't have to be specific to their identity. There are so many things that our young people are coping with. I mean, we all had our, right? We could list off the things that we had, but I do feel like with the increase in their exposure to things, that they are really coping with more and more. And so from my perspective, no matter what the issue is, if your child is in that level of distress, there has to be some communication that this is surmountable, whatever it is, whether you can tell me now, whether you can't tell me now, whatever it is, this is surmountable and that I'm here with you, you know, and it's okay to tell me. I know from my daughter in particular, she would tend to apologize. And I recognize I'm a mental health professional, so I have a leg up a bit in the in the talking parts, but just letting your child know that they're not alone. And even if you don't understand it, that nothing would be better if they weren't here. And that's not, again, specific to having a child that's questioning their gender identity or their sexuality. It's just any child that is experiencing depression, anxiety, any other sort of mental health issue, any other sort of discrimination where they feel like the solution is ending their life. It's just critical that we communicate to them nothing would be better if you weren't here. And kind of back to the previous answer that I gave, if that's all that you can give because you don't understand what else is going on for them, it's just important for them to know that it wouldn't be better if they weren't here and that you're there with them. And for those parents, this was actually something that when I was a newbie in this field, a supervisor said to me, because I was working with a family that was going through divorce, and I kept, and the children in the family were sort of telling me their distress, and I kept wanting the parents to hear it and like deal with it and be a resource to them, because in my mind they were the constant and I was just like this fill-in, you know, person for the interim. And the supervisor said to me, look, maybe the parents can't absorb that right now, but they did the right thing and brought their kids to you so that you can help them. So even if you can't, as a parent in that moment, be the person that they most need you to be, that's a perfect opportunity to engage a mental health professional, or again, someone in your faith community, or a trusted teacher or coach or another adult in your child's life that might be able to reiterate the message that nothing would be better if you weren't here. And we're going to figure it out together, you know, whatever the it might be. I'm getting off my soapbox.
Mariah or Elena, do you want to weigh in?
I think Virginia said it. Oh, yeah, I don't necessarily have anything to add at this moment.
Okay. So on the point about engaging a mental health professional, you know, I think it was mentioned earlier, it's not always easy these days. There's a lot of folks out there providing mental health, but they're all really busy. Sometimes it's challenging to find a mental health professional, and sometimes it's challenging to find a mental health professional that is trained and knows a lot about this topic in particular. So what are some resources or suggestions or strategies that you guys have for parents who are seeking support and guidance as they navigate these difficult conversations with their children and family members? You know, what are some resources that you're aware of? What are some that you've used? What are some strategies that you might offer to help people to get connected? Parents who want to support their kids, but don't really know how to have these conversations and want support either for themselves and their child. Elena?
This might be a little bit biased because I'm an English major, but I always recommend reading. There are so many invaluable resources out there. And it doesn't even have to be like a nonfiction source. There are LGBTQIA authors out there who are writing their stories, fiction, nonfiction, fantasy, realistic, like all of these different things. And just exposing yourself to these different narratives is a really, I believe, effective way of becoming more comfortable with having these conversations. And I do have like nonfiction recommendations in a stack by me that I can talk about later if you want. But yeah,
I put them in the chat.
Yeah. But yes, I am particularly biased to reading, and even children's literature, like there are picture books about gender exploration and understanding those things. So I think that's a really great place to start if you don't have access to a mental health professional.
Thank you. Mariah?
I'd just say, I'd add, like, I love YouTube. And if you're like, don't have the headspace to read, right, but you're still wanting to know more information about the issues, right, and the struggles that your kiddos are facing, there's really great YouTube channels on these issues. And so just with the Google search, you'll find some really good ones out there. I can also share a couple of the links. I think Out Youth, definitely people in Austin, Out Youth is a great resource, and I bet most of you know about it, but they offer individual and I think mostly individual and group therapy for kiddos that might be questioning or needing some extra support around their gender identity. I think PFLAG is also a good one, and finding the chapter in your community. That's a great place to find out more, educate yourself more on the issues, but also my understanding is a lot of them have support groups for parents.
Mariah, can you give can you speak what is PFLAG?
Oh man. And actually, when I was like looking at it today, just to make sure that they offer support groups, I was like, what does it stand for? And I was having a hard time, but I think parent is in there, right? Can anybody else help me?
Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, I think is the actual acronym for PFLAG. When I attended, 7 years ago to start, most of the parents in the room and the loved ones in the room, partners and friends, did have the person that they were there in support of was someone who was questioning their gender identity, not their sexuality. And so what people kind of took away from that was not that those that are gay or lesbian have less to face now necessarily, but that we've come a longer way in that regard, than we have with individuals who want to change their bodies and be regarded as something other than their sex assigned at birth. So the overwhelming experience here, at least, was that there really weren't, at least in when I was participating, there weren't any parents or loved ones in the room that felt like they needed to be there because they had a non-heterosexual family member. It was all for folks that had a loved one that was in the process of transition in some way.
Virginia, do you have any other resources or suggestions how people can get connected?
PFLAG was great for me. I mean, I'm in Connecticut, so I'm not very well versed in terms of what's available in Texas, but here the other place for myself and for my clients has been the hospitals and private care practices that specifically have gender programs either for youth or adults. They are very plugged into support groups. They may offer support groups. They have mental health professionals on staff. So if I can't speak to Texas, so I don't know how widespread that is. But if you have a child in your life or even an adult in your life who is associated with a gender program for medical care, they typically are pretty plugged into available resources for additional support if they don't offer it themselves.
Thank you.
Sure.
I think the one other just to mention is the Trevor Project, and that's if any of your LGBTQ youth are having suicidal thoughts, right? And they're needing immediate assistance, or if you're just worried about it, it's a number that you can give to them. They can call 24/7. They can even chat. They have a chat option as well. And I believe it also is a good resource for parents who are concerned about that as well, for if they have kiddos that are maybe having suicidal thoughts.
So now I'm going to kind of do a quick, I'm going to again reach out to the panel. Are there any questions or any topics? And this is to the participants that we did not cover so far, or we have not covered so far. I really want to make sure. I mean, I'm assuming you guys are all here for a reason, and if there are topics or specific instances, questions, concerns, or things that any of the participants have, I want to make sure that we at least attempt to address those things. So if you would just put something in the chat, we'd really appreciate it. We've got about 20 minutes left. And I want to make sure that, everybody who's here leaves feeling like we've addressed a concern or question that they have. And while I give everybody a couple minutes to do that, I guess I just want to say that I agree that the fact that, we're having some of these conversations and that the issue around sexual orientation in kids has sort of been de-emphasized, and that's sort of, for many, not really a thing that requires them to seek out support in a lot of ways is a win, right? I think for me, and this is sort of with any kid, and I think statistics around suicide rates of young people in this country in general across the board are so high. Me as a parent, as a mental health professional, and certainly as an executive director of a mental health organization, I have a lot of concerns about, I'm not going to say normalizing, but I'm going to say, I don't know, once a month or once every couple of weeks, we hear in the news that some young person has committed suicide. And I have concerns about us becoming desensitized to that, and it's sort of becoming then a little bit like, again, I don't want to say the norm because it's not the norm, but like that it just sort of one is after the other, and we kind of sit there and we feel badly about it. But then, it's difficult to know how to kind of manage that. And I guess I wanted to just throw out there, how, I guess for you, Elena, perhaps if there are peers or people that in your community, and certainly for you, Mariah and Virginia, as mental health professionals, how you approach or think about the rate and pace that this seems to be happening, and what kinds of ways that you communicate with peers or clients around to the point Virginia made, nothing would be better if you weren't here. It's one thing from a parent. I guess I'm asking this from a peer perspective, or from the perspective of someone that's not the parent, but that they're a ally or a friend or a community member, or just it concerns me that this seems to be a very kind of more increasingly common path that kids and adults are taking. So I'm looking for some thoughts or feedback on that.
It concerns me too. My younger brother recently came out to me, and he has given me permission to talk about this. I know that he's had some difficulty with that, and I was a space that he felt comfortable saying that, but I do know that he's around a lot of kids who are making a lot of comments, and a lot of adults who intentionally or not are giving these messages that it's not okay to be attracted to someone who's not of the opposite sex when, they're intersex people. So the sex thing doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but I mean, I have not lost anyone personally, but I do know people who have, and it is absolutely devastating. And I just can't comprehend why we're still in a place like that when there's so much conversation, there's so much queer community, and there's like people begging for just basic understanding and basic respect. And it's like, I don't know, I'm a little bit angry about it. I'm trying to like, we're on a panel, but I don't know. I think there is a lot of awareness of that in queer youth, and there's a lot of fear, but at some point you can only be unsupported for so long. And then it's just like, what do you do when people are not having these conversations, when people are not being loving and open to all identities? I don't know if that made any sense, but that's kind of my train of thought response to that.
Sure. Virginia?
Well, in my office, I would say it's similar. It's not being afraid to ask the question. I mean, I would rather a client, and I said it earlier, to you all, and I say it to my clients, I've asked this enough or said this enough, you're going to want to push me off my virtual chair. I will check in with my clients about any kind of suicidal thinking, and I'd rather offend them, though that typically doesn't, maybe even never happens. I'd rather offend them by asking. And this is across the board, not just with, this population, just in the pandemic, people who were impacted by, loss of job, or perhaps they didn't even have any sort of extreme circumstance, but just they seemed not themselves to me. I think it's just not being uncomfortable to ask the question, similar to being afraid to open up a conversation about gender identity or about sexuality because you don't want to put the idea into someone's head. It's the same, from my perspective, the same thing. Don't be fearful of asking the question, about a person's safety, or checking in with them if they seem a little bit more distant than they would normally be. So bringing it up, basically, just bringing it up. And the worst case that happens is they think you're a little nutty for asking, but but talking about it, talking about it with your clients, talking about it with your kids. If you see something that just feels off, or again, they're being more distant, they're in their room more, they're being, even with my daughter in particular, like taking a longer time in the shower, just things that were a difference would lead me to just check in, not interrogate, but are you doing okay? You seem a little bit more to yourself. And there was something else I was going to say, and now I've lost it in terms of a resource, and it will come back to me. I apologize, but something that either Elena or Mariah said jogged a thought about a resource, and now it's popped out of my head. But if I think of it, I'll say it, or I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you. Mariah, did you want to say anything about this?
I guess it would be just to add to Virginia, what Virginia was saying is that once you ask that question, I think kids need to talk about it, and they want to talk about if they're feeling safe, right? And it's trying to create that space enough to where they feel comfortable talking about it. Because if they can talk about it, I think the message for parents is like, they can talk about it. There are ways to help them with these thoughts, right? Concrete things. They might even know of things that could help them with these thoughts. And so, like Virginia said, I think it's just making for sure you ask the question, even though there's a lot of fear around asking about it or checking in about it.
Thank you. One other kind of question before, I know we're kind of getting close to the end here, but so I know a lot of times kids will, I think in almost any situation, kids will sacrifice themselves to protect their parents. And so very often, if you have a depressed child, as an example, it's like, no, I don't want to tell my parents because they're going through divorce, or they're really stressed out at work, or they've been fighting a lot lately, or my grandma's sick and my parents are tired because they're always going wherever to take care of her. A lot of times children will sacrifice themselves in support of their parents. It may not necessarily look like that to the parents, but that's often what they're doing. They don't want to burden them with whatever's going on with them, especially if they see that the parent is busy with something else or overwhelmed with some other stressor. So to the point around checking in around suicidal thoughts and all of those things, many kids will present as, no, I'm fine, because they don't want to burden their parents with what's going on with them. And I guess, and I'm going to direct this to Mariah and Virginia as mental health professionals, are there specific questions or strategies or ways that you feel like or things that you communicate to clients or in your own personal experience that helps to sort of circumvent that? Because it's very common. Kids of all ages will do that. And so again, I'm trying to kind of get at some of the things that are not kind of down the straight and narrow path, right? A lot of times you'll read comments or communication from children or young adults that have committed suicide, and or their parents will say, we asked, we talked to them, and they just sort of hid it, or they didn't, they present it as everything was okay for a really long time until they weren't here anymore. So what kind of strategies or ideas do you have, or do you recommend for parents to kind of, I mean, there's no insurance, but as ways to kind of try to get around the kind of blanket, oh, no, I'm fine, everything's okay, that sometimes kids will present? Jump in.
As a parent, I say I can take it. That's my, I mean, even if there have been some specific challenges in the last few months, and I have been tearful, like, and I can't hide it. And I don't think I have to. I mean, it would be my preference to, but it's okay for them to see us upset too, right? But even if I'm tearful, my approach as a parent is I will say, I can take it. Like, even if I'm tearful, I can take it. Give it over, tell me what it is that's going on. And I think as a mental health professional, if you are aware of the family, if you're privileged to be aware of the family context, which I know not every family can participate, but if you know either from the child or from the family that they're dealing with an aging grandparent, or they had a job loss, or they are going through a divorce, or if you are aware of the other stressors in the family, you can point out to the child, look at how much your parents can take. They're stressed, right? But this thing that you're carrying causes you to feel stressed or sad or tired or whatever the things are. And look at all they can handle. They're taking all this on. They can take it. They can take it. There's room for this. So just kind of pointing out that even if things feel chaotic, and I know there are sort of extreme circumstances where resources are really low, or there might be abuse or neglect, and those are kind of the outliers where we, I think, do need to bring in additional supports if they're available. But by and large, I think we can point out to, our young people that this is part of being a parent, this is part of being an adult, and look at all they're handling, and they can take it.
Thank you. Mariah?
I guess the only thing that maybe I would add is, like, if maybe trying, if they're unable to, and you have a strong suspicion that there may be some of these thoughts going on, right? If they're just not opening up and you're still concerned, right? Is helping them identify somebody that maybe they can open up to within their circle that's an adult. That they can talk to about what's going on.
Thank you. Elena, did you want to weigh in on this?
I do know that a tool that has been very helpful for me in communication with my parents is, this can be after I've said something to them, or if they have a question about how I'm feeling and I don't necessarily want to open up about that, because I still do that and I'm 20. But something that has been very helpful in our communication is the question, like, what can I do for you right now? And even starting a conversation with that, like, if what they need is a conversation, then maybe that question will be the starting point for that conversation. Or if it's just like to get out of the house for a little bit, or to eat something, but they, I don't know, don't want to cook or something like that. Like, it can be like, I feel like that question is a very general way that could start a conversation or give them some of that support that they might need, even if they're not talking about necessarily what's bothering them.
That's great. That's really helpful. Thank you. So in our last 6 minutes, I'm going to quickly do a thank you wrap up, and then I have one quick question to ask the panelists at the very end. So I want to thank everybody who joined us tonight. I want to thank our panelists so much, Mariah, Elena, and Virginia. This has been a really great conversation. If you happen to know of any child who could benefit from talking to one of our therapists, our walk-in clinic is open on Tuesdays at 3:30, and Spanish and English language therapists are available. Services are offered on a first come, first serve basis, and you can call us at 512-451-2242 or visit our website. I want to thank everybody who made a contribution to tonight's event. You are supporting children and families who would not otherwise have access to mental health care. And many of those clients happen to be from marginalized communities. So we appreciate that so very much. We will be this panel conversation happens monthly-ish. It's probably 7 or 8 times a year, so it's probably not going to happen in July, but we probably will have one in August. So, you know, please just be on the lookout for other conversations and other topics that we'll have in the future. As we mentioned earlier, the video and the list of resources will be posted on our website next week. If you know of anybody who couldn't be here but would be interested in watching the recording of this, please reach out and we will happily direct them to how they can access it. So finally, kind of my last question in the last few minutes is, you know, for the panelists, if there is one thing that you would want participants to take away from tonight's conversation, you know, what would that one thing be? And I'm just going to kind of go across. So I'm going to start with you, Elena.
Be curious, ask questions. I think that's a great place to start any conversation, especially if you don't necessarily understand where the other person is coming from or how they're feeling.
That's awesome. Thank you. Mariah?
It would be maybe get the support that you need, whether that's doing your own research or talking to somebody about maybe any questions or concerns that you have coming up for you as a parent or advocate.
Thank you. Virginia?
Are you meaning the takeaway for myself or the takeaway for anyone listening?
You can give me one of each. It's all good. Yeah.
The takeaway for myself would be to participate in more things like this that are available, just because I feel like I did have support, which was tremendously helpful, but probably not as much as I needed at the time. So doing things like this for myself will be helpful in reaching others. And for participants, give yourself grace. If you're a mental health professional and you goof it up, if you're a parent and you goof it up, the point is to be open, to be loving, and to keep at it. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have all the language perfect. You don't have to understand all the nuances of everything perfectly, but just keep at it, because kids and adults, whomever you're working with professionally or personally, that will come through to them.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much to all our panelists. We appreciate your time. There's a lot of other things you could have been doing on a Thursday night. So thank you so much for being here with us. And I hope to have some of you guys back, panelists. But anyway, thank you guys. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.